Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Sandy, how's class been going for you this semester?
Oh, it's great. I really like your business psychology class, but I have one major concern about the last assignment. You know, the one where we have to interview a local business owner, entrepreneur.
Are you having trouble coming up with interview questions?
Well, that's just it. I worked on my high school newspaper for years, so I actually have great questions to ask. The thing is, I'm new to the area, and I don't know people off campus. So I was wondering could you possibly give me the name of someone I could interview?
You don't know anyone who owns a business?
Well, yeah, back home. My next-door neighbors. They own a shoe store, and they're really successful, but they're not local.
Well, it wouldn't be fair to the other students if I gave you the name of a contact, but I could help you figure out a way to find someone on your own. Let's see. Do you read the local newspaper?
Sure, whenever I have the time.
Well, the business section in the paper often has stories about local business people who've been successful. If you find an article, you could call the person who's profiled.
You mean just call them up out of the blue and ask them if they'll talk to me?
Sure, why not?
Well, aren't people like that awfully busy? Too busy to talk to a random college student?
Many people enjoy telling the story of how they got started. Remember, this is a business psychology class, and for this assignment, I want you to get some real insight about business owners, their personality, what drives them to become an entrepreneur.
Like how they think.
And what motivates them. Why did they start their business? I'm sure they'd talk to you, especially if you tell them you might start a business someday.
I'm not sure I'd have the guts to do that. Opening a business seems so risky, so scary.
Well, you can ask them if they felt that way too. Now you just need to find someone to interview to see if your instincts are correct.
Now get ready to answer the questions. Number 1. Why does the student go to see the professor? Number 2. Why does the student mention her high school newspaper? Number 3. How does the professor help the student? Number 4. What does the professor want the students to learn from the assignment? Number 5. Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question.
Are you having trouble coming up with interview questions?
Well, that's just it. I worked on my high school newspaper for years, so I actually have great questions to ask.
What does the student imply?
Listen to part of a lecture in an anthropology class.
Okay, I want to begin today by talking about calendars. I know some of you are thinking it's not all that fascinating, right? But listen, the next time you look at a calendar, I want you to keep something in mind. There are at least 3 natural ways of measuring the passage of time: by day, by month, and by year. And these are all pretty easy to see, right? A day is based on one rotation of Earth. A month is how long the moon takes to move around the Earth. And a year is the time it takes for Earth to move around the sun, right? So they're all based on natural events. But the natural clocks of Earth, the moon, and the sun run on different times. And you can't divide any one of these time periods by another one without having some messy fraction left over. I mean, 1 lunar month, that's the time it takes for the moon to go around Earth. 1 month is about 29 and a half days. Not really a nice round number. And 1 year is a little more than 365 days. So these are obviously numbers that don't divide into each other very neatly. And this makes it pretty difficult to create some sort of tidy calendar that really works. Not that different cultures haven't tried. Have any of you ever been to Stonehenge? No? You know that amazing circle of giant stones in England? Well, if you ever go and find yourself wondering why this culture, way back in prehistoric England, would go to so much work to construct this monumental ring of enormous stones, well, keep in mind that a lot of us think it was designed, at least partially, as a calendar, to mark when the seasons of the year begin, according to the exact day when the sun comes up from a particular direction. I have colleagues who insist it's a temple, maybe, or a tomb, but they can't deny that it was also used as a calendar, probably to help figure out, for example, when farmers should begin their planting each year. The Mayans in Central America also invented a calendar, but for a different purpose. The Mayans, especially the royalty and priests, wanted to look at long cycles of history. So the calendar they used had to be able to count far into the future as well as far into the past. And not only were the Mayans keeping track of the natural timekeepers we mentioned before, Earth, the Moon, and the Sun, but another natural timekeeper, the planet Venus. Venus rises in the sky as the morning star every 584 days, and the Venus cycle was incorporated in the Mayan calendar. So the Mayans kept track of long periods of time, and they did it so accurately, in fact, that their calendar is considered about as complicated and sophisticated as any in the world. Now, the ancient Chinese believed very strongly in astrology, the idea that you can predict future events based on the positions of the stars and planets, like, say, Jupiter. Incidentally, the whole Chinese system of astrology was based on the fact that the planet Jupiter goes around the sun once every 12 years. So one orbit of Jupiter lasts 12 of our Earth years. Apparently, that's why the Chinese calendar has a cycle of 12 years. You know, like the year of the dragon, the year of the tiger, and so on. All parts of a 12-year astrological cycle that we get from the orbit of Jupiter. Calendars based on the orbits of other planets, though, are a lot less common than those based on the cycle of the moon, the lunar month. I could mention any number of important cultures around the world that have depended on lunar calendars, but there really isn't time. So let's go right to the calendar that's now used throughout most of the world, a solar calendar, based on the number of days in a year. This calendar is mainly derived from the one the ancient Romans devised a couple thousand years ago. I mean, the Romans, with more than a little help from the Greeks, realized that a year actually lasts about 365 1/4 days. And so they decided to round off most years to 365 days, but make every fourth year into a leap year. I mean, somehow you have to account for that extra 1/4 of a day each year. So every 4 years, they made the calendar 1 day longer. By adding the leap year, the Romans were able to make a calendar that worked so well that with a few minor adjustments, this calendar is still widely used today.
Number 6. What does the professor mainly discuss? Number 7. The professor discusses various theories on how Stonehenge was used. What can be inferred about the professor's opinion? Number 8. According to the professor, How was the Mayan calendar mainly used? Number 9. According to the professor, what was the basis of the ancient Chinese astrological cycle? Number 10. How did the Romans succeed in making their calendar more precise? Number 11. How does the professor organize the lecture?
Listen to part of a lecture in a biology class.
We've been discussing animal communication. Today we're going to talk about dolphins. Now, dolphins make a wide range of communicative sounds and also display something called vocal learning, which is the ability of an animal to modify its vocalizations based on its experience with other animals. There are many types of dolphin vocalizations. We still don't know their precise meanings, partly, I suppose, because we haven't really tried that hard to figure out their precise meanings. But we do know that dolphins use vocalizations as a way of communicating with one another. And we've categorized their vocalizations into 3 types: whistles, clicks, and burst pulses. The dolphin whistles are very high-frequency sounds, partially above the range of human hearing. What's fascinating is each dolphin has a signature whistle, which is unique to each individual dolphin. It allows them to call to and identify each other. Jennifer?
Kind of like learning someone's name? So, do dolphin parents choose names for their children?
Well, again, that's something we don't know, but we do know that no 2 signature whistles sound identical. And members of the same family, their signature whistles have similar elements. Dolphins use them as contact calls. They call to each other while traveling and foraging. It helps keep the group together and helps mothers and children find each other. Think of it like if you were traveling in the forest with one other person who was just out of sight, you'd call out, "Are you there?" And the other person would respond. But if there were several people in the forest, you would have to call that person's name to call to them. In addition to whistles, dolphins produce clicks, which are actually sonar or sound waves. They use the clicks to communicate, but more importantly, to navigate and hunt. How? Well, the sonar clicks bounce off objects, and then the dolphins convert the incoming signals into a 3-dimensional picture, a mental map of what's around them. The clicks are extremely sensitive and accurate. The sonar clicks are also very strong. And there's this theory that one reason dolphins swim side by side is to avoid interference from each other's sonar clicks. Interference would be confusing. It would prevent them from getting an accurate picture of their surroundings. And what's interesting is dolphins will turn off their sonar when another dolphin passes in front. The 3rd category of dolphin vocalizations is burst pulses. These are all the other sounds that dolphins make, like squawks, squeals, barks, groans, and so on. Burst pulses are used to display aggression, show dominance, and attract a mate. But whistles, clicks, and burst pulses aren't the only ways dolphins communicate. Does anyone remember any other ways?
In the book, it said that they also slap their tails against the water. Oh, and the air that comes out when they breathe or whistle, the bubble streams, they can control how the air bubbles come out. I thought that was really interesting.
Yes, the bubble streams are very interesting.
Dolphins can identify and locate each other by their bubble streams, and they can imitate the bubble stream patterns of other dolphins, sort of like saying hello. So, as you can see, dolphins use many different sounds and behaviors to convey messages to each other. I'd like to tell you about when I was a graduate student, and I spent one summer on a boat in the Atlantic Ocean studying marine life. One morning there were about 25 dolphins swimming with the boat. We could hear their clicks and whistles as they called to each other. Now, we were there as impartial scientists to do research. But how could we not notice the beauty as the bubble streams made patterns in the water and the dolphins appeared to dance and play? It's wonderful when you do fieldwork and actually experience something you've been studying in a classroom. So if you ever have the opportunity, go for it.
Number 12. What is the lecture mainly about? Number 13. According to a theory the professor mentions, why do dolphins travel side by side? Number 14. What does the professor imply about bubble streams? Why does the professor mention the time she spent on a boat doing research? Number 16. Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Think of it like if you were traveling in the forest with one other person who was just out of sight, you'd call out, "Are you there?" And the other person would respond. But if there were several people in the forest, you would have to call that person's name to call to them.
What does this example illustrate?
Listen to part of a conversation between a student and a university employee.
Oh, hello. Can I help you?
Yeah. I'm looking for Professor Kirk. Is she here? Is this her office?
Yes, you're in the right place. Professor Kirk's office is right behind me. But no, she's not here right now.
Do you know when she'll be back?
Well, she's teaching all morning. She won't be back until, let me check. She won't be back until after lunch. That's when she has her office hours. Perhaps you could come back then?
Oh, unfortunately, no. I have class this afternoon, and I was really hoping to talk to her today. Hey, do you know if she's accepting any more students into her Introduction to Biology class?
You want to know if you can take the class?
Yes, if she's letting any more students sign up, I'd like to join the class.
Introduction to Biology is a very popular class, especially when she teaches it. A lot of students take it.
Yeah, that's why the registrar said it was full. I've got the form the registrar gave me to get her permission to take the class. It's all filled out except for her signature. I'm hoping she'll let me in even though the class is full. You see, I'm a senior this year, and this will be my last semester, so it's my last chance.
Oh, wow, really? Most students fulfill their science requirement the first year.
Well, to be honest, I kept putting it off. I'm not really a big fan of science classes in general, and with the labs and everything, I've never quite found the time.
Your advisor didn't say anything?
Well, to tell you the truth, she's been after me to take a class like this for a while, but I'm double majoring in art and journalism, and so my schedule's been really tight with all the classes I gotta take, so somehow I never...
Well, perhaps you could leave the form with me, and I'll see if she'll sign it for you.
You know, I appreciate that, but maybe I should explain the problem to her in person. I didn't want to do it, but I guess I'll have to send her an email.
You know, not all professors check their emails regularly. I'm not sure if Professor Kirk does it or not. Here's an idea. Why don't you stick a note explaining your situation under her door and ask her to call you if she needs more information?
Hey, that's a good idea. And then I can leave the form with you, if you still don't mind.
Number 17. Why does the student go to Professor Kirk's office? Number 18. Why is the woman surprised at the man's request? Number 19. What does the man say about his advisor? Number 20. How will the man probably try to communicate his problem to Professor Kirk? Number 21. Listen again to answer the question.
You know, I appreciate that, but maybe I should explain the problem to her in person.
Why does the man say this to the woman?
Listen to part of a lecture in an astronomy class.
I'm sure you all have been following the news about Mars. A lot of spacecraft have been visiting the planet recently. Some have gone into orbit around it, while others have landed on it. And they've sent back an abundance of data that's reshaping our knowledge, our vision of the planet in a lot of ways. Is there anything that you've been particularly struck by in all the news reports?
Well, they seem to mention water a lot, which kind of surprised me, as I have this picture in my head that Mars is dry, sort of dry and dead.
You're not the only one. You know, for centuries, most of our knowledge of the planet came from what we saw through telescopes. So, obviously, it was pretty limited. And our views of the planet were formed as much by writers as they were by serious scientists. When the first science fiction stories came out, Mars was described as being a lot like Earth, except...
I know the planet was red and the people were green. I've seen some of those old movies. What were they thinking? I mean, really, they...
Well, it seems silly to us now, but those ideas were quite imaginative and occasionally scary in their time. Anyway, we began to rethink our image of Mars when the first spacecraft flew by the planet in 1965 and sent pictures back to Earth. Those pictures showed a planet that looked a lot more like our moon than Earth. Lots of craters and not much else. It was bitterly cold, it had a very thin atmosphere, and that atmosphere was mostly carbon dioxide. So the view of Mars after this first flyby mission was that dry, dead planet that Lisa mentioned. But then there were more visits to the planet in the 1970s. And this time the spacecraft didn't just fly by, they orbited, or landed. This allowed us to receive much more detailed images of the planet, and it turned out to be a pretty interesting place. Mars has a lot more than craters. It has giant volcanoes and deep canyons. It also showed signs of dried-up riverbeds and plains that had been formed by massive floods. So we concluded that there must have been water on the planet at one time, billions of years ago. Now, what does it take for water to exist?
You need to have a warm enough temperature so that it doesn't freeze.
That's one thing. And the other is that you need enough atmospheric pressure, thick enough air so that the water doesn't instantly vaporize. The Mars we see today doesn't have either of those conditions. It's too cold and the air is too thin. But a long time ago, there may have been a thicker atmosphere that created a greenhouse effect that raised temperatures. And maybe that combination produced water on the surface of the planet. So maybe Mars wasn't just a dead, boring rock. Maybe it was a fascinating fossil that was once alive and dynamic, worthy of exploration. Now, let's jump forward a few decades to the beginning of this century and a new generation of orbiters and landers that have been sent to Mars. Of course, the scientific instruments now surveying Mars are far more sophisticated than the instruments of the 70s, so we're getting all kinds of new data for analysis. And not surprisingly, that data is challenging our notions of what Mars is like. Lisa, you mentioned that a lot of the news reports talked about water. Do you remember any of the details?
Well, they were showing these pictures of these long cuts in the ground, which would be gullies here, on Earth. They say that since gullies are usually formed by water, it seems like they may be evidence that water still exists on Mars, but I didn't get how that worked.
I'm not surprised. There are a lot of theories, a lot of speculation, and some argue the formations aren't caused by water at all. But there's some ingenious theories that assume that there's a lot of water right under the planet's surface that somehow is causing the gullies to form. If we could only get a lander there. But the gullies aren't in places where we can send landers yet. Anyway, if there is some kind of water activity, it may change our view of the planet once again to something that's not dead, not even a fossil, but rather a planet like Earth that undergoes cycles. Think of our ice ages over long periods of time. Maybe Mars could sustain water again at some distant date.
Number 22. What is a lecture mainly about? Number 23. According to the professor, what was concluded about Mars after the first spacecraft flew by it in 1965? (24) What does the professor imply about conditions on Mars billions of years ago? Number 25. What is the possible significance of the gullies found on Mars in recent years? Number 26. Listen again to answer the question. Why does the professor say this?
So, maybe Mars wasn't just a dead, boring rock. Maybe it was a fascinating fossil that was once alive and dynamic, worthy of exploration.
Number 27. Listen again to part of a lecture, then answer the question. Why does the student say this?
I know the planet was red and the people were green. I've seen some of those old movies. What were they thinking? Really.
Listen to part of a lecture in an art history class. The professor has been talking about colossal statues.
We've been looking at colossal statues, works of exceptionally huge size, and their essentially public role in commemorating a political or religious figure. We've seen how some of these statues date back thousands of years, like the statues of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, which you can still visit today, and how others, though surviving only in legend, have fired the imagination of writers and artists right up to our own time, such as the Colossus of Rhodes, that 110-foot statue of the Greek god Helios. Remember, this same word, colossus, which means a giant or larger than life-size statue, is what today's term colossal derives from. Now, it was one thing to build such statues at an equally colossal cost when the funds were being allocated by ancient kings and pharaohs. But if we're going to think about modern-day colossal statues, we need to re-examine more closely their role as social and political symbols in order to understand why a society today, a society of free, tax-paying citizens, would agree to allocate so much of its resources to erecting them. A good example to start out with would be Mount Rushmore. Now, many of you have probably seen pictures of Mount Rushmore. Perhaps you've actually visited the place. Mount Rushmore in South Dakota is a colossal representation of the faces of 4 U.S. presidents: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln, carved directly into a mountain. Imagine, each of those faces in the rock is over 60 feet high. Now, carving their faces took over 6.5 years and cost almost $1 million. And this was in the 1930s, during the worst economic depression in U.S. history. Does that strike any of you as odd? Well, I personally think that the Great Depression of the 1930s actually makes this more understandable, not less so. Often it's the case that precisely at times of hardship, when the very fabric of society seems to be unraveling and confidence is eroding, that people clamor for some public expression of strength and optimism, perhaps as a way of symbolizing its endurance in the face of difficulty. So, with that in mind, let's go back to Mount Rushmore. Actually, the original motivation for a colossal monument in South Dakota had very little to do with all this symbolism, and everything to do with money. You see, it was first conceived of basically as a tourist attraction, and it was supposed to feature the images of legendary figures of the American West, like the explorers Lewis and Clark. The government of South Dakota thought it would bring lots of money into the state. It was only later on that the sculptor, the artist who designed and oversaw the project, a man named Gutzon Borglum, decided the project should be a monument honoring 4 of the most respected presidents in U.S. history, much more than a tourist attraction. Its very prominence and permanence became perceived as a symbol of the endurance of U.S. ideals and the greatness of the country's early leaders. So, you see, what began as a tourist attraction became something far loftier. Let's look at another example of this phenomenon. The Statue of Liberty is another colossal statue, one that I assume a number of you are familiar with. But I would guess that, like many people today, you don't realize that when it was designed over a century ago by a French sculptor, it was intended to symbolize the long friendship between the people of France and the people of the United States, one which dated back to France's support of the American colonies' war for independence from the British. But the shift in the statue's meaning started soon after it was built. Back in 1883, Emma Lazarus wrote that famous poem, the one that goes, "Give me your tired, your poor," and so on and so forth. That poem describes the Statue of Liberty as a beacon of welcome for the entire world. Well, in the early 1900s, it was put on a plaque on the pedestal that the Statue of Liberty stands on. From that point on, the Statue of Liberty was no longer perceived as just a gift between friendly republics. It now became a tribute to the United States' history of immigration and openness. This association was strengthened in the imagination of the general public just a few decades after the statue's completion with the immigration waves of the early 20th century. especially since the statue happened to be the first sign of America seen by those immigrants sailing into the port of New York. So, as with Mount Rushmore, the original motivation for this colossal statue was forgotten, and the statue is now valued for more important reasons.
Number 28. What does the professor mainly discuss? Number 29. What evidence does the professor give that supports the idea that modern-day colossal statues are valued social and political symbols? Number 30. According to the professor, what was one result of the Great Depression of the 1930s? Number 31. According to the professor, why did the state of South Dakota originally want to create a colossal monument? Number 32. Why does the professor discuss the poem by Emma Lazarus? Number 33. Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Back in 1883, Emma Lazarus wrote that famous poem, the one that goes, "Give me your tired, your poor," and so on and so forth.
What does the professor imply about the poem by Emma Lazarus?